oh, just let me oh.
That clock keeps ticking like a metronome, and my thoughts keep telling me to get me home, but my balls keep telling me to let me oh, just let me oh.
Let's turn back the clock to a simpler time. Nuclear war was imminent. The double helix was discovered, and Rolex dropped one of their most iconic models. The Turnograph was a watch that, for its time, was overlooked. It was a prototype for what was to come. The Turnograph would be the catalyst for two of the most important sports pieces that would change the foundations of watches forever. So came the Submariner and the GMT, two watches built for two singular purposes. The one being a tool, used recreationally and by professionals for its ventures under the sea, being waterproof to certain depths, with a rotatable bezel that could record elapsed time and decompression stops. The other for its ventures in the air, created as a tool for the purpose of tracking more than one time zone, the bezel being able to be set forwards or backwards to determine time across continents. These models were both based on the Turnograph design aesthetic. Both were simple, sleek, elegant, and small, designed to be worn as a different class of watch, primarily as a watch that could be worn with a suit, but also for their unique purposes. To this day, 60 years later, these are still some of the most iconic watches on the market. Almost anyone in the world can recognize the case, the black dial, the Pepsi bezel, the Cyclops. These traits have become synonymous with the Rolex name. But speaking as a designer, it is my responsibility to share the truth about what works and what doesn't work. And the Rolex GMT, from a design point of view, should not look the way it does today. More specifically, why, after all of these years, does the GMT still look like a Submariner? Let's break down the history of the Submariner, because the development of its design language has been reviewed again and again over the last 50 years. The model began simply with an oyster case, screw-down crown, and rotatable bezel. By the time the 5512 arrived, the model was beefier, with added crown guards and a bezel with harder knurling. It was at this time that the watch had increased waterproofness, being able to withstand 20 atmospheres of pressure. The 5513 introduced many innovations, including sapphire crystals, a thicker case design still, and a more robust bracelet and clasp. Over the last 20 years, we have seen a massive change to the formula. The aluminium bezel has been replaced with a ceramic insert. The bracelet again has been overhauled, using milled parts instead of stamped parts. And the case, much to the chagrin of many purists, has been living on a diet of anabolic steroids. The Submariner is a fantastic case study into how a brand has been able to develop and innovate one of their prized products. But now returning to the GMT, this is where things become less interesting. The original case shape and design mirrored the Submariner. Its bezel was a fantastic innovation with fully loomed numerals. It also incorporated the same design language with a big crown and sleek lines that made it an excellent steel dress watch. Then the 1675 was introduced. This model to me is where the design language was lost. Now the watch had crown guards. Why? The watch dial was laid out exactly the same as the Submariner. Why? Its only differentiating feature at this point was the date complication and the multicolored bezel insert. Fast forward a few years and the 16710 looks almost identical to the 16610. Yes, there had been incremental changes to the watch, but on the whole, let's be real. Moving to the modern era, with the 116610 and the 116710 side by side, these two watches are virtually identical. So what's my point? My point is that the GMT was never originally proposed to be a diving instrument, but looks terribly like one. The innovations that came to the watch were primarily because of the Submariner, and it is because of the Submariner that the watch looks the way it does today. So here's a thought experiment. Hypothetically, let's imagine that the entire GMT line was discontinued, or that it never existed after its introduction in the 50s. What should the GMT have looked like? If you want my thoughts, the GMT should have taken the form of the Sky Dweller. Why do I say this? Well, back in the day, traveling by plane was a luxury. The Sky Dweller is the sort of watch that suits the build from a design point of view, sized down to a more manageable size, produced in both precious and non-precious metals, it would be a watch suited for all occasions. I think that a design like this has been on the minds of many at Rolex for decades, but they have lacked the technology to make it feasible until now. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Sky Dweller's proportions, but it is an interesting watch. Now, after hearing all of this, you probably think that I hate GMTs, but I don't hate GMTs. I really enjoy them, especially the Batman. They are amazing watches with huge potential, but my point around this discussion is to address that of all the models that Rolex produces, the Submariner and the GMT are the only two watches that share near identical DNA. This is a brilliant cost-cutting formula, but the GMT should be its own individual watch, and not one that is in the shadow of its cousin. The sad thing is that, after half a century, the design will probably never change. The latest release of the Pepsi that we saw last year has shown the watch on a Jubilee bracelet, and the model's lugs have been tapered down. These are all steps in the right direction, and maybe the modern lineage of GMTs will have their own language. So if it took me less than 5 minutes to slap together these concepts, imagine how much more amazing this watch could be.